We encourage you to hit the subscribe button right now so you can listen to more podcasts of Operation Truth. Ladies and gentlemen, we do want to hear from you, so we encourage you to email us directly at operationtruthofficial@gmail.com. I want you to know that your messages are likely to be heard, addressed, and listened to on air.
Operation Truth, the show they don't want you to see. Now, here's your host, Lou.
Hi, everyone. Before I start to speak today, I want to apologize for my voice. I've been a little bit under the weather. You can hear it, I'm sure. So I'm hoping to speak less today and let Tom kind of carry this project. I want to start with this discussion about the borders. Tom and I, independent of the podcast with TJ, we've been talking about the sudden shift of migration interest, which is now a community in San Diego, California's border, called Lacumba. It's spelled Jacumba, but it's pronounced, I believe, and I'd like to be corrected if I'm wrong, Lacumba. I think the focal point there, they're encountering people there from Syria, mass numbers of individuals from China. And I want to go right to Tom right now about this whole discussion of Chinese migrants targeting the United States and what he knows about this new point of entry. Tom?
Well, China, in terms of the illegal immigration from China, that's been going on for many, many years. Even when I was in the FBI running the organized crime program and then later running International Operations Division, the Chinese, there are groups in Fujian province of eastern China that roughly they affiliate with each other. They're called snakeheads. And in fact, when you go there, as I had been there a couple of times, you see their houses and they literally have, giant snakes on their roofs, staring out at the street and all of that. So the snakeheads, at the time I was in the Bureau, were estimated to be bringing in 1 million illegal Chinese out of China, some to Australia, Canada, and the United States, the majority of which came to the United States illegally. And that went on for years. It was an embarrassment to the Chinese government that their own citizens would want to leave the promised land and go elsewhere, but that's what was happening then. Now what's happening, it's being reported now by newspapers like the Epoch Times and others, that China is now very embarrassed about the video of Chinese young men taking buses all the way to the Texas border and into the United States and being allowed in. That's an embarrassment to them. Why would these healthy young men want to do that when they're military age? They should be staying in China. Well, what they're doing, China is cracking down on tour groups. They're cracking down on these individuals because under their social credit system, it's much harder to get out of China today to travel internally or even externally to and from China because of that system. But China, so the question is China allowing many of these young men to come here to infiltrate our military or to become spies, conduct espionage, do other things? That remains to be seen. But, they're being gathered, they come across the border and they're given a court date, come back in 10 years to apply for asylum or to apply for refugee status. And then they give them money and cell phones and let them loose. So this is ongoing, and allegedly China's cracking down. We'll see if that's true. They cracked down 20, 30 years ago only because they were embarrassed of anybody wanting to leave. Just like the Soviet Union was embarrassed when people risked being shot and did get shot going over the Berlin Wall to get out of East Berlin into West Berlin and then eventually try to make it into West Germany. So you have a similar situation. It's politically difficult for China to justify or explain why all these young men want to come to the United States, unless it's part of a spy program like we had in the late 50s, where we sent a couple dozen young Marines to pretend like they wanted to defect to the Soviet Union, Lee Harvey Oswald being one of them. And then they went to Soviet Union and said, I'm a communist. I've denounced my citizenship. I've turned in my passport with the United States. I want to be a communist. I want to be, in the Soviet Union. And many of them got in. Well, the Russians, the Soviets, I should say, KGB, knew they were coming. knew who they were, and in turn set them up with young KGB female agents so that they'd get married and bring them back to the US and let them loose in our country. So it's not the first time a country has thought of this idea, we being one of them, to bring people to another country to conduct espionage or infiltrate the country. Now, regarding the Chinese, you have Illinois Senator Dick Durbin. We've talked about this 2 weeks ago. He gives a speech on the Senate floor. This could be a good thing. These young, and these Chinese young men look fit and healthy, and I almost said filthy. They don't look filthy. They look very neat and proper and fit and everything. And Durbin's answer to this is, we could put them in our military since our military cannot keep up hiring quotas. Navy, Army, Air Force cannot hire enough people to maintain our ranking in our U.S. military. So Durbin's idea is, well, if we let them in the military, that would fast track them to be U.S. citizens. If they're U.S. citizens, then they can vote. And theoretically, they would vote Democratic because they're so grateful to be in the U.S., to be allowed to do this process. So that remains to be seen in the long run, what all these young Chinese males are going to do or want to do. But in the interim, thousands are coming in.
Tom, it isn't just Chinese males that are coming through the southern border. They mentioned today in the media that the focus of the shift in individuals coming across the border has gone from mothers with children to mostly adult males who are single. And the question now is why, but I asked you a question off the podcast. If the Democrats understand what they're doing to the safety and the security of this nation, and you and I are of the same opinion, not much of a back and forth there. Apparently, they don't really care.
No, they're doing it on purpose. This is part of the overall strategy to weaken the United States. And they're not apologetic or making bones about that. That's their strategy. So the difference is that they're being assisted by China. How do they get from China, where you can't get on a flight or a train or a bus if you don't have a high enough social credit score? These individuals don't look like degenerates, and they're not gonna get a good score from China. They look like they're perfectly able to have a high score and to have the Chinese want them to go and assist them in getting flights to Ecuador and some of the surrounding countries of the northern part of South America, where then they go to where the hotels are, Colombia, South America. And then at the hotels, then they catch the buses. All of these arrangements have been made by somebody who, to get on these buses and be transported from South America to Texas. And then they get in. So obviously, China knows they're coming and probably is assisting them as part of a deliberate program to have all these people flood the United States. And if possible, if they could flood our military, all the better. Weaken the United States right at the control of our armed forces.
Tom, I want to go into this World Health Organization discussion that we had prior, but what is really confounding is we're watching the impact on our major cities. Eric Adams speaks to it almost on a daily basis, the damage that's being done to the city of New York in a multitude of ways, which includes but isn't limited to corporations leaving, for example. We're hearing it in new cities every day, whether it's Maine or Seattle or Denver. Denver said they're inundated. I don't understand how they could be short-sighted and them not understanding what the end game is here. But I want to talk to you about this World Health Organization, some type of law or ruling that they want to implement that would impact our country.
Okay, normally, if another country or organization tries to implement a treaty with different countries, sign up for this treaty, in the United States, it's set up in our Constitution. If we're going to sign up for a treaty, it takes 2/3 of the U.S. senators to affirm the treaty. But with the World Health Organization, obviously, they have probably enough people that know they're not going to get 67 U.S. senators to say, here, have this treaty. we'll just have the president issue an order. We're going to implement it, like the Paris Accord. President can put it in, president can take it out. But for now, Biden can put it in. Now, what the World Health Organization wants, and the head of the WHO, Tedros, gave a speech last week at the government summit that was in Dubai, and basically said, here's what we want. This is what this law would be for the countries where we're going to implement it. And it basically is the WHO can decide if you have a pandemic, not you. You don't get to decide. Your individual states don't get to decide. That becomes law for the entire US government to issue, whether it's vaccine mandates, mask mandates, lock down the schools, lock down the businesses, all of the different things that we saw a couple of years ago at the height of our pandemic, all could be done in every country that's part of this agreement. And that would be it. It would be law. So like a treaty, if treaties on genocide, treaties on treatment of war criminals, treatment of, many different situations, those treaties that are in agreement, like the Geneva Accords, when a country signs up to that, it's law. It takes the effect of being a national law for that country. Well, in this case, even if the Senate doesn't affirm it with 67 senators or more, it would become law under this theoretical agreement, because Biden would say, this is law. We're going to abide by this rule from the WHO.
Well, Tom, but because the president or the WHO imposed some type of mandate or a new governing rule, doesn't necessarily mean we have compliance. You and I both witnessed Texas and Florida to begin with. We went into this whole lockdown, mask mandate, vaccines. Florida basically said we're going to do.
Well, most of those things were recommendations of the federal government, that the states weren't required absolutely to enforce that as law. So some states, like Florida and Texas, said, no, we're not going to lock our businesses out. We're not going to issue these mask mandates. We're not going to close our schools, all of those kind of things, because it wasn't a federal law. But if it's a treaty, and theoretically presidential order for this treaty, then it could be considered. And that would create a constitutional debate. If the states refuse to abide by that, can they do that?
Well, the thing simply stated is, if they could pass whatever they want and the president can say whatever he wants, it doesn't necessarily translate to compliance, though, Tom. We're witnessing that right now.
It doesn't necessarily, but it's a long way toward it for a lot of states then. Now they feel like they're going to have to, because then the federal government has the levers of what grants they provide to the state, cut off their funding in different programs. There's a number of levers, most of which are weighted to the federal government side, not to the states.
Yeah, but Tom, let's take another look at Texas, for example. The president came in and ordered Texas to allow the Border Patrol agents to access this fencing along the southern border. Texas basically created the park, forbids them from coming in, and they've flat out come out and said, they come in, cut the wire all they want, we're going to replace it. That's an
they can replace it. They can do that and set up this crisis. But what did the Supreme Court say? What did they say? The federal government gets to issue those orders. Federal government rules the border, not Texas,
and
not
explain
California.
why that's important, Tom. Explain why that ruling is important long term.
The long-term importance of it is that right now, the person that we have in the White House theoretically in charge is pretty much an idiot. And he's pretty much said he's going to leave these borders wide open. I don't care. He doesn't care. This is what we want. Now it gets into a constitutional battle. And that raises the question, why Texas wait 3 years to start this? But in any event, Supreme Court comes in and says, Texas, you can't decide on your own, nor any other state, that you get to control the border, the policies of the border, the laws that govern entry into the United States. That's federally controlled. And therefore, you don't get to tear down, or put up wire, whatever you want. Federal government decides. Now, where that's important is in 11 months, we're going to have a new president. Pretty, 99% sure Biden will not be sworn in for a second term next January. So that now, theoretically, you get a new president 11 months from now. that says we're closing the border back down. We're going to reinstate the controls that were in effect during the previous Trump administration, little over 3 years ago, that kept our border pretty secure, pretty locked down. We're going to put that in effect. Well, the advantage of the Supreme Court decision is when the government, federal government, decides to do what it's supposed to do, control the borders, enact the laws previously put in place by Congress. When that happens, we hope in 11 months, you don't want people like Gavin Newsom saying, "Nah, we're not going to. We'll do what we want. You don't get to decide our border with Mexico. I'll decide. We'll decide." You don't want that. So you want what the Supreme Court decided was, and we've been asking for strict constructionists to be on the court to go by what the Constitution says and do it. Don't make up their own laws as they go. So what they're basically doing is enforcing the Constitution by saying, Texas, you don't get to decide what you want to do or don't do at the border. Federal government controls the border. Now, the fact that they're not, it's still federal government policy and federal government jurisdiction. Now, 11 months from now, theoretically, we might be very grateful that that's what the court decided.
So, Tom, I want to be clear so everybody listening or watching this, it's the responsibility of the federal government to protect this country's borders as a whole. The problem here is they're not doing that. And now Texas has taken upon themselves to protect their southern border. And the bottom line is that correct? Is that the right thing, Tom?
Personally, I don't think so. I agree with the court that the federal government needs to maintain control of the border one way or the other. Because otherwise, as I said, 11 months from now, if Texas goes blue and becomes a Democratic state and new president comes in, theoretically, let's just say Trump comes in, he says, I'm putting in all the policies I had when I was president the first time. And this new unknown new Democratic governor in Texas says, no, you're not. We're not going to put up with that. You don't want that. You want the federal government to once again take control and enforce the laws that have been in place at the border. And so in the long run, this could be a great decision. In the short run, it's not. But in the short run, having Joe Biden as president is not a good thing either.
Tom, the problem is, sounds like we're setting a scenario where the federal government could be a paper tiger, because in the same breath that we're talking about Biden ordering the borders pretty much be reopened, allowing the Border Patrol agents to come in, cut and remove this razor wire. If the next president comes in and says, we're going to close the borders, and the governor in that state, Texas, for example, as you mentioned, says, no, we're going to have them over. We're going to let people flood in. Here's the problem. Enforcement, Tom, paper tiger. We can make all the rules you want, all the laws you want. You can't be a paper tiger. And I hate to say this, but I think that's what we're starting to look at.
I agree. You don't want a paper tiger. But on the other hand, federal government controls grants going to the state of Texas, all kinds of money that could be withheld, all kinds of power that could be enacted. So if you get into a contest, let's say, of who has the most power between the state of Texas and the federal government, Texas will lose in the long run. In the short run, right now, they're losing. In the long run, now that depends. When you say paper tiger, well, that depends. If we have a president who's all talk and no action and decides, the policy Joe Biden had, that wasn't so bad, we'll just leave it alone. Well, then you're going to have that. But the power is supposed to reside in the federal government.
You and I agree 100% on that point. But I'm telling you, right now, we're witnessing states who are legalizing marijuana, which is still a Schedule I controlled substance with our DEA and our federal government. And they're basically telling the states, are telling the federal government, stay out of our business. That's another example. We've got laws here, Tom. We could put in laws, but when you get into this enforcement discussion, we're having another discussion here. So I think we're on very tenuous ground, which is why leadership is so critically important, and that the agenda be one in which is in the best interest of this country as a whole, starting with its safety and security. Because to be very candid, and I think you'll agree, Tom, if we lose the country, you won't have to worry about gun control, pro-choice, your energy sector, we won't have a country that has structure enough to address these issues. Guys, you've got to pay attention to what's going on here. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to come right back. I want to talk to Tom about this young man, Navalny, who was recently passed away in Russia. It's being suggested he was murdered. Tom's going to give you an interesting perspective on this based on his experience as a former assistant director of the FBI in charge of the international operation. We'll be right back, guys. Stay with us.
Hi everyone, I am TJ Stone, the producer of Operation Truth, and I'm just taking a moment here to remind you to go follow us at Operation Truth Official on TikTok, and you can find us at Operation Truth Official on Facebook. We're on Instagram. We don't do as much on Instagram for reasons. On X, formerly known as Twitter, you can find us at Operation Truth and the number 7, Operation Truth 7, and always email us at operationtruthofficial@gmail.com. Be a part of this conversation. Join the operation.
And while we're waiting for Tom, I want to bring up something that's of critical importance. It's helping the public understand why the cops aren't going to help you. We're witnessing the cops in the city of New York, over 5,000 assaults on your police officers last year. A couple of weeks ago, we watched a gang of illegal migrants, people that have broken the law to enter this country, jump and assault 2 police officers. One of them was a New York City lieutenant. No consequences. Bragg, the DA in New York, didn't see it was necessary to remand this individual, that they weren't flight risks. That's a felony if you assault a police officer. By the way, in the same breath that we're talking about violent offenders in the city of New York, we're playing footsie with Donald Trump over business dealings where nobody was a victim. Better yet, let's not enforce the laws and remand people who are violent offenders, repeat violent offenders, robberies, sexual assaults, etc. Let's go after him now for Stormy Daniels. Now, let me be honest with you, and I don't mean to insult Stormy, but we should impeach him for bad taste. I know people are going to find that funny. I apologize to you, Stormy. I didn't mean to say it, but it is kind of humorous. It just is what it is. But your police aren't going to step up for you, ladies and gentlemen. It's just the way it's going to be. You have to understand the climate in which you've created, or you've allowed your elected officials, a minuscule percentage of them, to create this environment where they want to defund the police. Better yet, we want to take their pensions and incarcerate them, take it from their families. Every time you go by near someone in the city of New York right now, you've got to write a report. If for some reason you get involved with an individual in New York, they can then turn this and prosecute you for a misdemeanor. Pay attention, city of New York and the rest of your country, because this is coming to you all across the board. It's already happening in cities like Chicago, Baltimore, Philadelphia. It's shameful to think that our capital, Washington, D.C., has surges in crime in the manner in which it does. Your carjackings are over 106%. We've gone after FBI agents, elected officials, a block away from their workplace. I understand they went to carjack part of a Secret Service detail that was attached to some of the Biden grandchildren and children. I can't keep track of who's getting protected today and who isn't. But guys, this is the fiber of your country. You know, this complacency, this indifference, this distraction, you better put your eye on the ball. And I'm not inclined to tell you who to vote for because I don't want to insult your intelligence. I would just tell you, take a look at the trajectory of this country the past 3 years and tell me if you were better off than 4 years ago. And the simple answer to that question is you're not. And I'm not a Republican. I'm just telling you the truth, guys. I'm a teller of the truth. I'm not promoting anybody's political platform. I'm suspect of all of them, and I'm concerned that the system may be irreparably broken. I don't know if we can fix this at this point. We're in such a divide, and tragically leading the animosity and the rhetoric taking us in the wrong direction is your media, which goes unaddressed every day. We just kind of gloss over it. They create your narrative and your optic. I've explained that to you a number of times. Tom, I think you're back. I want to talk to you about this Navalny. Are you there, sir?
Yeah, I'm back.
Yeah. So, Tom, give us a little background on Navalny and what you think is really going on.
I don't know what's really going on because there's so much contradictory news coming out about it. Everybody in the West wants to use Navalny's death as proof that Putin is a psychopath, evil head of the country and all of that. other reports that I've read that aren't necessarily from, our media, other medias in the world are basically saying that Navalny was basically insignificant to Putin or the Russians. His support in Russia was something like 2%. He was not a political figure there. He had no real power or threat to Putin, that he's a rival or any of that. So that's the problem. We have so many contradictory reports that we don't know the details for sure at this point. It could be either one. Did Putin order him killed? Why? When he wasn't a threat, we don't know. But, any more than, Epstein died in our prison in New York. Why? Or we have Gonzalo Lira in Ukraine, an American citizen who gets locked up, who's telling his family that the Ukrainians are torturing him because of his criticism of the Ukraine war and the administration's support of the war, and then he ends up dead. And you don't hear a word about that. So, what's going on in this situation, we don't know for sure, and I really don't want to speculate.
Can I ask you this question, Tom? If he wasn't of significance, right, why would they have gone through the trouble of incarcerating him? Couldn't they have elected an option like?
Now, supposedly he had violated some other laws there and had been involved in a number of schemes, let's say, over the last couple of years. So that's what they're saying. Again, we don't know what charges were cooked up or not cooked up or what it is. But I don't think there's enough direct evidence, as President Biden says, Putin killed him, basically. Well, we don't know that.
Tom, tragically, this all circles back to the credibility of information that's being provided to us, which is why you and I can't give anyone a definitive answer as to what exactly transpired with this individual one way or the other. Another question I would ask is, if he was such a thorn in their side, why not put him out of the country? Why not banish him and not allow him to even be in Russia? But again, Tom, I think the what you brought to light is the fact that we're having a problem with agenda. We're politicizing this. I did want to mention that the president threatened Russia that if something happened to him, there would be consequences. And the other day he was questioned on that, and he referenced the fact that Russia lost 350,000 troops in the Ukraine. I know they don't think much of the American public in this country, that they don't hesitate to insult our intelligence. But what in God's name does Russia's presence in the Ukraine have to do with this man dying? And how is that a consequence to his death? And I'm sure you heard this as well, Tom.
Yeah, but most of the issue of how many dead Russians in the Ukraine, that sounds like it's way out of proportion, which many of our former military leaders who still have contacts at the Defense Department are saying that the ratio of Ukrainians killed to Russians, for every 7 or 8 Ukrainians killed, there might be a Russian killed, that they have not experienced that level of losses in the Ukraine. So what, basically, is what I would say.
So let me ask you this then, Tom. What would be the significance if Putin took over the Ukraine again and made it part of Russia, which it once was? I know that they're rattling this saber about.
Well, the problem is Putin, for years, everything he said about that is he doesn't want Ukraine. He doesn't want to take it over. He doesn't want to unnecessarily kill Ukrainians. And they've had a number of issues like that going back to. Now, go back to 2014, where the president that was elected at the time is basically wants to have peace with Russia. And we engineer a coup to overthrow him. He flees, he goes to Russia, and then we have 2 puppet governments in a row. We have Zelensky now, but his predecessor we also had put in. And at that time, Putin sees the handwriting on the wall, because his red line had always been that the West promised Russia that we would not move NATO further east toward the Russian border. And yet we lied. We did that steadily for many years. So he drew another red line. He said, no, Ukraine has to be neutral. It cannot be NATO, because we don't want NATO, therefore US, weaponry on our border, the Russian-Ukraine border, which the Ukraine then could launch our missiles and hit Moscow and other eastern or western Russian cities in 8 minutes or less. So it kind of like he doesn't want their equivalent of the Cuban Missile Crisis, having dangerous weapons that close to their border, threatening to attack him. So he drew that line. And then they had all kinds of meetings and accords. You have the Minsk Accord, because part of the Ukrainian military is Nazi. And the Nazi part has been shelling the regions of eastern Ukraine that are pro-Russian, the Donetsk and these other provinces there, killing thousands of citizens there that are basically consider themselves Russian. And after 2014, basically said, we're Russian. We want to join Russia. We don't want to be part of Ukraine. We want to be safe. We don't want to be attacked by the Ukrainian military, by the Nazis. And therefore, we don't want that. Now, Zelensky, current president of the Ukraine, when he ran for office a couple of short years ago, he promised the Ukrainian people he wanted peace with Russia. He didn't want to have a war with Russia. He didn't want to do that. He gets elected on that platform. Then, after he's president, he's negotiating, and negotiations take place first in Minsk, in Belarus, and then later in Istanbul, where Putin's representatives and Zelensky's representatives come to an agreement to have peace in the Ukraine. They won't join NATO. They'll stop shelling the citizens of the Donetsk, that area, and do that. Well, Putin recognizes that he doesn't trust our agreements because we frequently lie. And so, therefore, he doesn't trust it. And then later, you have publicly Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, and Macron, head of France, basically say they participated in the Minsk negotiations, signed the Minsk Accord for the purpose of delaying any issue with Russia so they could build up the Ukrainian army for the purpose of later attacking Russia, which is what happens. So you have a couple of years of their theoretically peace, but meantime, we and the EU, NATO are building up the Ukrainian army, preparing them to attack Russia. That was our ultimate policy at that time. So you have these issues going on. And then you have the ultimate agreement was Zelensky's representatives meet with Putin's representatives in Istanbul, Turkey, and they come to an agreement. Zelensky tells Putin he agrees with the agreement that they're going to have peace with Russia and they're not going to attack and they're going to stop doing all of these things. And right after Zelensky makes that agreement, you have Boris Johnson from the UK, Prime Minister of the UK, fly to Kiev and tell Zelensky, no, you will not sign a peace agreement with Russia. We, the UK, NATO, and speaking for Biden, we are all on your side. You are not to have a peace agreement. You are to keep building up your military in preparation for war with Russia, basically. That's what happens. Now, meantime, since the 2014, when we commit the coup and overthrow the duly elected government of the Ukraine, Putin recognizes that he takes Crimea. He recognizes that the island, or almost island, of Crimea in the Black Sea has been Russian since 1776, since Catherine the Great. And therefore, he does not want to lose. When they got along fine with the Ukrainians for years, no problem. But now, with this hostile government going into power in Ukraine, he feels like he better solidify Crimea to be Russian again. Have the Crimean people vote. They vote that they're Russian. They want to stay Russian. And the reason it's so important is because Russia has two main naval bases. One is Murmansk at the far northern edge of Russia, and most of the year it's under ice. That's the naval base you see in the movie Hunt for Red October, the submarine coming out of the base and it's frigid cold and all of that. Well, they cannot use that port for destroyers, aircraft carriers, other surface vessels. Only submarines can get out of there. So their warm weather port for a couple hundred years has been Sevastopol in the Crimea. Now, back in the 1850s, England and France, several countries took on Russia, declared war, sent troops to Crimea for the purpose of capturing Sevastopol, capturing the Crimea. They're defeated. Thousands of British soldiers die, French soldiers die. They don't make it. So Crimea stays Russian at that time. Now, this is right before our Civil War, in the 1850s, Crimean War. So now you have Putin take over Crimea and say, that's it. It was Russian for a couple hundred years. We're keeping it, and we're maintaining control of it. Because it was fine when we were allies with the Ukraine. We weren't worried. But now it's clear Ukraine is now going to be a puppet or a surrogate for the United States and NATO to attack Russia, which ends up what actually happened.
So, Tom, I just want to tie something in with this as well. You mentioned that Putin's concern is that they would have a NATO nation on their border, Ukraine. Understandable. Last year, everyone, if you were paying attention, Finland and Sweden both applied to become part of NATO. Finland was approved. Sweden wasn't. Sweden borders Russia. Am I correct, Tom? And that could be the holdup and why they're not been approved to become part of NATO.
Well, the question is, how much of a threat is Russia to them now or in the past couple of years that they had to hurry up and join NATO? So, I think that's a political issue in those countries, but it doesn't directly concern what's happening on NATO's eastern front, which is Russia. So that's the difference there, is that, what is so important up there? Just like you hear, people now say, well, Russia's going to take over the Arctic. They're going to take over this or that. The main issue is Eastern Europe on the border of Western Russia.
Interesting. Guys, we're going to wrap for today. I hope this has been helpful in you understanding some of the politics of the world and the fact that we're having an issue of credibility of information that's being provided to us. Tom spoke about this young man, Navalny. There's a little more to the backstory on this individual as far as his significance in Russia. But more importantly, we can't get the story straight here, guys. We're in a lot of trouble. We're going to come back next episode, next podcast. I want to bump into this discussion about Iran. We keep attacking Iran-backed individuals. Don't know why we don't go after Iran. In the same breath, I want to have a discussion with Tom about the impeachment of Mayorkas over the border and why not Biden? Because my perspective is that, he's carrying out the policies of Joe Biden, which is, again, he's carrying out the policies of this left wing of the Democrat Party that apparently has no concern for your safety and security. This has been Operation Truth. I encourage you to become part of this conversation. Contact, critique, criticize, whatever you see fit. This podcast, we want to hear from you. You don't have to be like-minded. Please understand something. This is not a political podcast. This is a podcast about trying to tell you or convey to you the truth. Communicate through Operation Truth Official at gmail.com. Thank you for joining us today, and I apologize for my raspy voice. And Tom, I thank you always for your insight and your wisdom. Cannot
Thank you,
measure
Luke.
the importance. We'll see you next time, guys.